Hey there, everybody. Getting ready to finish up the last part of the Chapter 6 lecture notes. We'll be talking about Imperial Rome again today. I think where we left off last time, we were we had just finished talking about the five good emperors, and we should be picking up, yes, here with the frontiers and provinces of Imperial Rome. Now, you know, at the empire's height in the second century, which of course would be the 100s AD, the Roman Empire covered about 3.5 million square miles, had a population of over 50 million throughout the empire and all the lands that were considered holdings of the empire. Now, the imperial government based out of Rome did provide, as I say in the notes, a degree of unity. What the Roman government realized over time, and this even goes back into the Republican period, is as they brought a new territory into the Republic or the Empire, the fewer Roman laws, Roman customs, things like that that were forced on the native populations, generally the easier assimilation went. If you didn't force these things on people, then they're more likely to adopt them slowly over time. If you try to force them on people, it's going to end up making them resent Roman rulership. So generally at a local level, the groups that are absorbed by the Roman Empire, they're tended to give a lot of leeway in terms of what they're allowed to continue doing. Very seldom did religion become a major problem. Native religions become a major problem for the Romans. Honestly, the only reason that Christians were persecuted, to any great extent by the Roman government is because the Jewish leadership in that region of the empire had a problem with these early Christian converts, and they're the ones that went to local Roman rulers like Pontius Pilate and pointed these individuals out. You also have to take into consideration there was a lot of misunderstanding by the Roman population as Christianity continued to spread. There was a lot of misconception about what exactly Christians believed at this point in time. But that's a point for a different day. In terms of what the Roman government allowed and the way things changed as time went on, in terms of, for instance, citizenship. In the Republican era, that was something that was given, it was kind of like the carrot dangling out in front of the horse, to entice it to move. In the Republican era, citizenship was given or was granted to an individual, to a family, as repayment for deeds or repayment for duties carried out for the Republic. By the time you get into the 3rd century AD, I talk about here in this sub-bullet 212, Caracalla ended up giving or granting citizenship to all free inhabitants of the Roman Empire. If you weren't legally a slave and you lived in Roman territory, you were given Roman citizenship. You had two basic languages, while there wasn't a state language in the West, which would have been the Italian peninsula to the west. Latin was the standard language of communication. Now you still had, the Gauls, you still had the Germanic tribes in Northern Europe, you still had the Spanish in the Iberian Peninsula. They all had their own native languages, but Latin was the standard language in terms of being able to communicate throughout the western half of the empire. Uh, you know, anybody that was a local official of the Roman Empire is going to know Latin. Anybody that wants to communicate with Roman soldiers in that region, anybody that is going to be traveling throughout the western half of the empire should know Latin to be able to communicate with anyone else of different ethnic backgrounds throughout that half of the empire. Then, if you look to the east, because it was already an established language because of the Greek civilization, Alexander the Great's process of Hellenizing the Near East. Greek had spread through territory that eventually the Romans would end up conquering. And as the Romans end up taking the eastern part of the Mediterranean, that's where you start to see the split occur, where the Western Empire, or from Rome west, ends up speaking Latin, and from Greece eastward, Greek is going to end up being the standard language. And Greek in the eastern half of the empire played the same role that Latin did in the west.
Again, just the that are in those those have 3 calls, and one take in 10 calls, and one take in Roger, and one take in Irvington. You need to have a there at those schools when you get there. If you're not on the other schools, you look for them and see what again, you need to have other schools have kids with there later, so little buses are in this way, so you can get you a sack of lunch. And thanks for your hard work today, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Now, like I said, Greek was the language of the East the same way that Latin was the language of the West. It didn't mean that people in their homes, in their native regions, didn't continue to speak their native languages. It's just if you expected to communicate with Roman officials, if you expected to communicate with Roman soldiers, then, or if you were going to be traveling throughout the eastern half of the empire, you needed to be able to understand Greek so you didn't, experience any language barriers. A lot of the inhabitants, if they weren't going to come into contact with government officials, if they weren't going to come into contact on a regular basis with soldiers and need to communicate, there was no need to learn Latin or Greek. It's one of those things where if you were going to go on vacation to a foreign country, it wouldn't hurt to know some of the local language to at least, have the most basic communication skills, but you don't have to learn the local language. Whereas on the other hand, if you were going to travel for educational reasons, if you were going to attend school as an exchange student, if you were going to take a job in a foreign country, even if it was only for 6 months or 1 year, in that case, you're going to be there for an extended period of time. You're going to have to interact with the locals who would not be able to speak, in our case, English. Then it really would be in your best interest to learn more of the local language. Buying something like Rosetta Stone, or to learn the basics, and then once you get there, do whatever you can to immerse yourself in that culture so you learn their language. But looking at it from the position of the Romans, if these were Roman soldiers that were stationed in Gaul, or if these were Roman soldiers that were stationed in modern day Syria, they're not going to learn the local language. The locals are going to need to learn their language. But if you weren't going to have contact with government officials, with soldiers, if you weren't going to do a lot of traveling, then there wasn't any extreme need to learn Latin or Greek, depending on which half of the empire you were in. Now, during the rule of Augustus, he had a policy. He was trying to, as he saw it, fix Rome. So in his eyes, the worst thing that could be done is to continue to expand Rome's borders and thus avoid the problems that he saw as bringing the Roman culture down. I'm not saying that he was against other ethnic groups or other societies. It's just he saw an immediate need to deal with the problems in Rome, and that's what he spent most of his reign doing. He had advised against future expansion of the empire. Well, even though he didn't refer to it as the empire at that point, it had already become an empire. And most of the Julio-Claudians and the Flavian rulers followed suit. But as you start to move, I mean, even through the latter, even as you move through the latter Julio-Claudian rulers, you do see expansion to a degree, but definitely as you get into the era of the five good emperors, the empire has begun to expand. I mentioned down here, even though Augustus had advised against future expansion, 54 or in the year 54, Claudius ends up annexing Britain. That is something that what's going to happen is the different ethnic groups within the British Isles, as the Romans come into contact with them, the lower half of the main island, England, Scotland, Wales, while the lower half of the island was more easily subjugated by the Romans, the upper half of the island, which would mainly be Scotland, proved to still be quite a problem. So what happens is Hadrian, during his reign, he ends up building a wall. That's what Hadrian's Wall was that I mentioned in the little bit that I talked about him earlier. He ends up building a wall. It's just a defensive barrier, and there would be checkpoints along the wall, gates where people could travel beyond Hadrian's Wall. But there was a great deal of fear among Roman citizens that of the barbarians that lived north of Hadrian's Wall. That was just a very strongly defined border between Roman territory in the British Isles and free territory or non-Roman territory in the British Isles. Now, it was under the policies of Trajan. You do see Trajan bring several sectors into the Roman Empire. Dacia, modern-day Romania, Mesopotamia ends up being absorbed into the Roman Empire because certain regions, maybe not the entirety of the Hellenistic kingdoms that came out of Alexander's empire, but Rome starts to, by the rule of Trajan, get its foot in the Near East, and he ends up annexing Mesopotamia, the Sinai Peninsula. Now, during the rule of Hadrian, he focuses a little more on the west. He withdraws Roman troops from Mesopotamia, and they begin fortifying their border along the Mediterranean coast, maybe 75 to 100 miles in from the coast. That was their main focus, not so much farther to the east into the Fertile Crescent region of Mesopotamia. Now, the problem that had developed militarily with the empire was, and I have it down here italicized, no strategic reserve. The empire, and this is one of the reasons that Augustus had warned against expansion of the empire, is that the military was already stretched too thin defending the borders. And of course, as while some later emperors stick with Augustus's policy, others end up stepping out and stepping out of that policy, define their own policy, and they start to expand in certain regions. That creates more of a problem. Because troops tend to be away from the center, as they tend to be towards the borders, the frontier. Okay. Because all of the soldiers are towards the borders protecting the frontiers, because that's where the most tension between Romans and non-Romans were. It tends to be on the outer borders where the frontiers are. Those are the most newly conquered regions. If a revolt breaks out anywhere in the empire, but specifically on the interior, then troops have to be pulled from the frontier where the biggest threat was. Well, if you pull troops from the borders to the interior, that weakens your defenses on the border. If a revolt breaks out on the border, somewhere, anywhere in the empire, and you have to shift troops to that area where there is an active revolt, that creates weak spots, and you could have a flare-up and another revolt breakout. And that is the biggest problem, is that it was like you really want a peanut butter sandwich, and there's plenty of bread, but you go into the cabinet, you get the jar of peanut butter out, and you open it up, you look in it, and it doesn't look like there's enough there for a whole sandwich. So you just end up spreading it really thin across the bread just to try to get everything covered. That is what we're looking at in terms of the Roman military. They were spread too thin over the empire. And if any major problem arises, then you're going to have a situation where, by drawing troops from one region to a region with an uprising, you're creating the possibility that another uprising will begin, because now you have a weakened military presence in those areas where you move troops out of. Just to give you an idea of how the army had to expand to address this problem, when Augustus died in the year 14, Rome had 25 legions. By the time you get to the year 117, it had jumped to 30 legions. By the year 200, it had extended to 400,000 total troops, both standing and auxiliary or reserves, foreigners that had not gained citizenship yet, but still served the military, but weren't considered part of the legions themselves. Legionnaires during the time of Augustus had to be citizens. So during Augustus's time, the army was primarily from the Italian peninsula. By the time you get to the year 100, again, addressing this issue of the army was spread too thin, you had to bump up recruitment. Italians also, you have to take into consideration the Italian peninsula here, the borders way out here in the Far East, in Western Europe and Northern Europe. Rome itself didn't seem to be under any direct threat. By the year 100, the Roman Empire was the power in the Western world. And back home at Rome, they didn't see any direct threats. All the threats were out on the border. So why would an Italian want to join the army, be sent into some backwater fort on the frontiers, barbarian land as it would be looked at by the Romans? They had to increase the recruitment somehow, because Italians were not joining the military. By the year 100, they had started recruiting non-Italians, and by the time you get to this point, the turn of the century, only 20% of the actual Roman army was Italian. Uh, that that's a positive in the sense that it will lead to bringing these people into the empire, granting citizenship to them and their families, but it does cause a few other problems. One, these people that are joining may have been the people that the Romans were fighting against initially when they seize a territory. So you could deal with the issue of these people weren't completely loyal to the Roman cause. Also, they might not feel the same sense of duty that a Roman native or an Italian native might have to the Roman Empire, because they were brought into the empire. Even if it wasn't by being conquered, they might not feel the same loyalty. But again, reinforcing the point that having 80% of the legions made up by non-Italians, and there were cases throughout Roman history where you did have individuals that maybe had started off as part of the auxiliary army, the non-Roman sector of the military, and they weren't loyal. They still had strong roots in their local communities, their native communities, and it did lead to more friction. It led to the possibilities of, if you want to think of them like double agents. But more often than not, you didn't have that much of a problem with that specific issue. It was just the fact that these people were not Italian, they were not Roman by blood, so they didn't feel quite the same loyalty to the Roman government, because a lot of these soldiers had been born and raised in these far provinces, and they had never actually even seen Rome with their own eyes. Military camps tended to be centers for cultural diffusion because you had this concentration of Romans where you spoke Latin, definitely Roman law applied to these soldiers, whereas in the local communities, more often than not, local culture continued to be the rule of law. They just answered to Italian magistrates. But if you went into the Roman camps, or as those camps end up becoming permanent settlements, anybody that comes into those towns, into those villages, and trades, or their job takes them into that town, you're going to see the spread of the Latin language, or in the East, the Greek language. This is how a lot of people come into contact with a lot of different Roman institutions or aspects of Roman culture. And then over time, those aspects start to be adopted in the local population. Now, you also have situations where soldiers may end up taking a wife from that region, especially if they're stationed there for several years and they had not been married before they joined the military. Or if, say, you have someone from a citizen from Spain joins the Legion and they end up being stationed in Gaul, they might end up taking a wife from that region. The travel of slaves, that's another thing. You fight in the army, and sometimes your pay isn't necessarily in gold. There were different points in time, soldiers were paid in salt because it was so important to daily life. There were times where soldiers were paid in land in a region that had just been conquered by the legions. There were times where soldiers were paid, prisoners were taken during times of war, and those prisoners were given over to soldiers, and those prisoners end up becoming slaves. And that was a method of paying their soldiers. You get a little plot of land, you get a handful of slaves, and now you can start up your own little agricultural estate, and you already have field hands to work the land for you. And of course, if you are given land, even if you're from northern Italy and you end up being stationed in Gaul, and you end up being given land in Gaul, and you end up with slaves that might travel with you, but you end up using them to work that farmland, you're going to be staying in that region more than likely, maybe not all the time, but that's probably going to become your residence as opposed to going back to Italy and then having land in modern day France. And if that's the case, they probably end up taking a wife from the local population as well. Like I said, those military encampments, as time goes on, turn into something more permanent. Towns become villages, villages become towns, towns become cities. Now, in most cases, local officials remain in power. Natives, that people that are willing to work with the Romans, they generally choose local officials because putting a Roman official in charge of a foreign population that had just been conquered, that is probably going to lead to more friction. Whereas you have a Roman governor that finds out, okay, this individual or this family, this group of individuals are willing to work with the Romans. So we start installing them in local leadership roles. They're natives, they understand the language, they understand the customs, but they are willing to work with Roman superiors. So in a lot of cases, local officials end up being chosen from the upper class of the native population. They didn't receive any pay. They would have to find other ways to make a living, but by serving in these local leadership roles, they end up gaining citizenship. They forge connections with more influential Roman leadership, and that in turn ties them to Rome, and it creates an opportunity for a little bit of social advancement up the ladder. As you start to see more natives in these provinces gain citizenship, gain leadership roles, and get promoted over time, you see a big shift in the makeup of the Roman Senate back in Rome. As of the year 50, you had a small, just a handful of non-Italian senators. One of the big changes up to the year 50 had been when plebeians start to be allowed to serve in the Senate. For hundreds of years during the Republic, you had to be a patrician. You had to be able to trace your family lines back to those original 300 senators' families at the foundation of the Republic. And then over time, plebeians are allowed to hold seats in the Senate. And that was a major breakthrough in terms of equality. But plebeians that served in the Senate during the Republic era, they were still Italian, if not specifically from the region directly around Rome. But then as you go through the rule of Augustus, as we get into the early empire and you start to see this transition to non-Romans or non-Italians, because once they gain citizenship, they are Romans. But once you see Spaniards and Gauls and people from the Germanic tribes gain citizenship, and they work their way up the hierarchy in terms of working within the boundaries of the imperial government, you start to see non-Roman families gain seats in the Senate. By the time you get to the year 200, less than 50% of the seats in the Roman Senate, which remember, it went from 300 seats to 600 seats under Julius Caesar. Then it expanded again to 900 seats. And then when Augustus comes into power, he lowers it back to 600. Well, by the year 200, less than 50% of the seats in the Roman Senate were of Italian descent. And that's just a byproduct of more non-Italians gaining their citizenship. Looking at where the golden age of literature, written in Latin, dates back, into the west of the during the imperial period. It's referred to as the Silver Age. Now, or the Golden Age wouldn't necessarily go back at the late Republic, the very early empire during the reign of Augustus. Literature coming from the 150 years following the reign of Augustus is referred to as Silver Age. Maybe not quite on par with the literature that was produced during the time of Augustus. But then again, Augustus was on the hunt trying to find talented writers, and he was doing everything he could to promote the greatness, the grandeur of Rome. I mentioned Seneca before, where he was arguably the most famous Stoic philosopher of the Roman imperial period. Even though Stoicism was a Greek school of philosophy, it was the only one that really caught on with the Roman culture. He served as a personal tutor to the young Emperor Nero. He advised Nero early in the emperor's reign. Eventually, he commits suicide by the order of the Emperor Nero, who, I mentioned this in the story or in the section where I talked about Nero, that Nero held little regard for human life other than his own, possibly even leading to the death of his mother. Seneca, who had been his teacher for years, had served as his advisor when he took over as emperor. Stoics had no problem with the concept of suicide, and they, like I said, they didn't have a problem with it, to the point that if they felt that they had dishonored themselves, their families, the state, they saw no problem with taking their own life. Nero just wanted to test Seneca's conviction as a Stoic and ordered him to take his own life. Well, if he feared death, like most people do, then he might have questioned the emperor's order. But like I said, they saw no problem with it. If you dishonored your family, dishonored yourself, dishonored the state, well, he would dishonor himself, his family, and the state if he opposed a direct order from the emperor. So when the emperor tells him to take his own life, Seneca does so. Even though he's considered one of the greatest philosophers, one of the greatest philosophers, period, in Roman history, it's not necessarily an ending befitting someone of his position. And again, it also gives you quite a bit of insight just in that one little case to the way that the Emperor Nero thought, or where he placed human life in terms of importance. Tacitus, again, while he might not be on par with some of the historians of the Golden Age, he was considered the greatest historian of the Silver Age. You might consider him today, I wouldn't necessarily call him a social justice warrior, but he did fall in line with certain aspects of what Augustus would have held in high value. Tacitus wanted to point out the faults in Roman society, display the corruption that was very apparent in imperial politics, in the Roman government, and also the decadence of Rome's upper class. Now, that's something that Augustus would have also agreed with, because that fell in line with his moral legislation that he was trying to enforce. Whereas the corruption in the Roman government, Augustus would have wanted to get rid of that corruption, but he wouldn't have wanted a spotlight shined on it. So certain aspects of Tacitus's writing would have gone well with Augustus. Other aspects might not have. Juvenal is considered the greatest poet of the Silver Age. He was a satirist. Generally, satire is used to point out flaws in society, point out problems, but doing it in a humorous way. Anytime you hear me talk about satire, a modern case of satire, even though I don't think that it's on par with where it was years ago, Saturday Night Live uses a great deal of satire. People like Stephen Colbert use satire. Let's see, John Oliver, to an extent, also may be considered a satirist in terms of the way that they present certain things. to point out problems, to point out flaws, to make fun of certain individuals or certain instances, but using humor to point those flaws out. He pointed out the abuse of slaves. He was not a supporter of the issue of slavery, but it had been an institution in Roman society for hundreds of years. Again, another person that points out the decadence of the upper class, their style of living, the extravagance of the emperors during this time period compared to, say, the lifestyle of Marcus Aurelius or even the first emperor Augustus before him. He was not a wealthy individual, so his own part, even though he was a well-known writer, he was poor for the most part, and that there was he pointed out that there was a great deal of inequality in Roman society during this time. Now, Rome itself was the largest city in the empire by far. By the time you get to the year 32 BC, even as we are technically not in the imperial period, Rome was close to 1 million people in population by that point. Nationalities from, it was a great melting pot, nationalities for all across the empire. It was like, any modern city that has, well, now we have so many more things that could create noise and traffic that it wouldn't even have to be 1 million strong. But, you've got an ancient city here with 1 million people in it. It's overcrowded. It's noisy. It was so overcrowded in the busier parts of town, what would be considered downtown. Wagon traffic was banned during the day just because there were so many people, stalls in the markets and things like that. There wasn't room with all the people milling around on foot. There wasn't room for wagons. People could get trampled, people could get run over because everybody is rushing about doing their own thing. Poverty was a big issue. Crime, of course, was a big issue as well. More so in the poorer neighborhoods, but anywhere where there was a large population, a large crowd at any given time, crime is going to be an issue. The rich lived in, I refer to them as comfortable villas. They would have estates within the city, just outside of the city, plenty of room to spread out, whereas the poor are going to be cramped into apartment blocks called insula. Those apartment buildings tended to be made of concrete with wooden walls, poorly constructed, quickly constructed. They might be 3-4 stories high, and of course, with poor interior bracing, what happens is those buildings could, especially since they weren't, it wouldn't be any different than slums in more modern times. The buildings get created hastily, corners get cut in terms of construction, and then especially as they start building levels on top of each other, the weight of the structure, if you don't have a good internal support structure, it was easy to have collapses, cave-ins. Since the buildings had wooden floors, since the buildings have wooden interiors, wooden support structures, over time that wood dries out, and you have a situation where, one mishap with fire and it all goes up in flames. There were a lot of great public buildings built during the imperial period. And again, because you had such large populations, you had a large number of poor, there were a lot of things that were constructed for the benefit of the entire public. Now, granted, there might be different facilities for the wealthy and for the poor, but a lot of public facilities, temples that were open to the entire population, public bathhouses, so now, of course, this isn't like going into like a locker room and having shower stalls. These baths would be more for soaking, and the bathhouses, you might have bathhouses for the poor, but the large beautifully decorated bathhouses tended to be for the wealthy, and they were more like spas, where you would soak. It's not like you would have these things that were like swimming pools, and they would even be heated from under levels within the building structure. Amphitheaters where people could be entertained, whether it was through plays, whether it was through gladiator matches, whether it was chariot races, and then of course government buildings were open to the population as well. Rome itself, when I say Rome was a great parasite, because of the massive population, it consumed so many resources. It definitely consumed more resources than the local area was able to provide. 200,000 poor, a quarter, just to get, or not even a quarter, 20% of the population received free grain. Like I said, the Republic and the imperial governments had welfare programs where people were given free grain. Rome itself went through 6 million sacks of wheat, of different grains a year. And that in a lot of cases that they consumed so much in terms of grain that it had to be imported in from the far extents of the empire to Rome just to keep the city running. Uh, Aqueducts just to make sure that people had fresh water, to provide water to the bathhouses, things of that nature. Aqueducts were created to pull water in from many, many, dozens, hundreds of miles away from the city of Rome. And they did this in other areas as well. Anywhere that they had a major population, they would probably build aqueducts to some local source of water. But Rome, to provide enough water for everyone in the city, and even then it was questionable as to whether it provided enough water to everyone in the city. Aqueducts were built, all over this region, but really all throughout the empire. It's not like you're going to have aqueducts that carry water from the Swiss Alps all the way to Rome. It wouldn't go quite that far, but they had to find ways to get enough fresh water in the city to provide for the people. Now, in terms of entertainment, in addition to food, entertainment was also provided by the emperor, by other wealthy individuals, politicians. It was a way of campaigning. It was a way of subduing the population, or by providing food, by providing entertainment. In a sense, it made the people forget maybe about how bad their life was. If there was a period of famine, if there was an outbreak of plague or something in one area of the empire, holidays might be declared where people didn't have to go to work and they were provided free spectacles. It might have been gladiator games, it might have been chariot races, whatever the case is. It was a reason to party, a reason to forget their troubles, but in a lot of cases, it was a political ploy to keep the masses occupied, keep them distracted. Now, like I said, there were three main types. You had chariot races, you had plays, and you had gladiatorial matches. The best thing that I can compare Roman gladiator matches to, we might want to think that, especially if you watch, I got a picture down here from the movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe. You might want to think that gladiator matches were fights to the death, and at times they were, but it was very small windows of time. It was less MMA and more WWE. During the largest periods of time, while there were certain periods where there were gladiator matches to the death, in a lot of cases, gladiator matches were not to the death. People still might get injured. It's just like with professional wrestling, where you have a wrestler that will sneak a razor blade or something like that, in their trunks or in a wristband that they come out to the ring with, and then after they get hit in the head with something and they're rolling around, they've slipped the blade out and they kind of cut themselves up in the hairline, so blood started flowing down into the face. you know these gladiators, they were trained athletes, they were trained warriors. They knew where you could cut somebody. They knew how to create a superficial wound that would bleed. It would look good in front of the fans, but it wasn't going to cause any severe damage. It's not to say that accidents didn't happen, that gladiators didn't get hurt seriously. It's not to say that gladiators didn't die when it wasn't supposed to be a fight to the death. It was just looked at as, that was part of, that was something that went along with it. But most of the time when gladiator matches were in vogue and, were popular, they were generally predetermined who was going to win. The gladiators came up with characters, backstories, and like I said, it was like professional wrestling. These people were entertainers. They were characters that were on display for the entire crowd. Gladiators had fan clubs. There were obvious good guys. There were obvious bad guys. Sometimes you would have betrayals between partners that fought together. And it was a soap opera. It was just like modern professional wrestling. In terms of the chariot races, I would have to compare chariot races to modern NASCAR. It had a huge following all throughout the empire, and the most exciting parts of the races were when things started getting chippy between different chariot drivers, and the best seats on the course to have were, in the ends where the turns were, because, where a NASCAR track has a huge oval, and while the turns might be sharp on shorter tracks, it's not like a amphitheater that was set up for chariot races, where a NASCAR track might be shaped more like this. An amphitheater, and it would tend to have a wall or at least posts, but a chariot track would be shaped more like this. With posts at the ends where you could make your turns and a wall in between. So you have very sharp turns on the ends, and that, of course, traveling at high speeds with a team of horses and a small chariot leads to accidents. So that is why people attended chariot races, is they were really exciting to watch. Now, again, you didn't have these gladiator matches just in Rome. There would be chariot races, there would be gladiator matches all throughout the empire. But what you did have to have are these amphitheaters. The oldest amphitheater that's been discovered up to this point was in Pompeii, dates back to about 75 BC. While they were excavating the remains of Pompeii in recent times from the great volcanic eruption, they have discovered the remains of an amphitheater. Again, this dates back to about 75 BC. Of course, the best known of all amphitheaters ends up being the Colosseum in Rome, which that's what's depicted here. The most famous exterior facade that people tend to see, and then the interior. And if you look here, there would have been a wall. Actually, you might have had an artificial floor even built this high, and then there would have been a floor across this area. All of these down here, these were like holding cells. These were waiting rooms, holding cells, whether it was for wild animals, whether it was for prisoners, whether it was just gladiators. and very elaborate situations. There were systems of pulleys, elevators, and this area down here in the ground, in the subfloor of the Coliseum, was actually multiple layers deep. I want to say it was at least like 3 layers deep. And what would happen is they would have these elevators that, if it was wild animals, if it was slaves, whatever the case was, they would have these elevators that could raise them directly into the center of the competition floor. Other cases, it would be like in a basketball arena, football stadium, one of those WWE events where they walk out from an enclosed area into the arena, make their big entrance, and the fans would start going wild. The Coliseum is the best known of all amphitheaters throughout the empire. It was in the city of Rome, held about 50,000 spectators, roughly the size of what you would see from the larger baseball stadiums or basketball arenas today. Larger NFL stadiums tend to be a little bit larger than that. College football stadiums tend to be larger than that. The largest amphitheater of all was Circus Maximus. It held about 200,000 spectators at its height. Roman society tended to be violent, so their entertainment was as well. That's why even if gladiator matches were rigged or predetermined, and even if they weren't to the death, again, it was violent entertainment. The chariot races, people went to see the accidents. They went to see chariots overturned. They went to see one chariot spin out of control and take out 2 other chariots. People trying to get out of the wreckage of their chariot and maybe get sideswiped by another chariot that's flying around the corner out of control. It's very bloodthirsty, but it's a reflection on the society at the time itself. That's another reason why you have, in some cases, periods where gladiator matches were actually fought to the death, and then other cases where it was just, like I said, a soap opera. Like I said, the gladiator games tended to be from dawn till dusk. Sometimes during these festivals, matches might go on for days at a time. Other times it would be an announced event that, in 2 weeks, it would be promoted throughout the streets in Rome. In 2 weeks, gladiators from all over the empire are going to come to Rome and, watch. If your favorite gladiator was coming to town, like I said, people had fans, just like if you ever watch wrestling. People have T-shirts of their favorite wrestler, or they have posters, they have signs that they hold up during the show. People cheering, people booing. It was the same way for these gladiators. During the popularity of gladiator combat, some men were slaves and forced to fight as gladiators. Others were free men that, if they were fighting for themselves, if you were a slave, you fought for your master, and your master made money based off of your fights. But you had a lot of people that would enter into gladiator combat to make money for themselves. If you become one of these stars, you could be extremely successful. Then again, if you fought in some little rinky-dink outpost, you probably didn't make very much money, but there's an opportunity you'd get discovered, and you might get an invite to one of the larger settlements and be able to play a role. And there, again, it was just like each city had its own league, and some stars were big enough that they could travel around to these different arenas. Like I said, most of them were one-on-one, refereed and scripted. That wasn't always the case. And sometimes, especially at the Colosseum in Rome, just because it was equipped to do so, they might have historical simulations. Now, of course, they'd be scale battles, but you might have 2 teams instead of one-on-one combat or 2-on-2 combat. You might have 10-on-10, 15-on-15 combat. The Colosseum at Rome was large enough that you could have something like that. And, these gladiators represented the Romans at the Battle of Zama. These soldiers or these gladiators represented the Carthaginians. There were other times where they flooded the floor of the Colosseum. Now, they probably only flooded it about 3-4 feet deep, but they would pump water. They had waterproofed the floor for the most part, and they would fill that area with water, and then to simulate naval combat, they would have gladiators fighting on small rafts, small boats. And again, you might only be dealing with 10 gladiators in 4 ships or 4 boats, but they would represent Roman naval vessels and Carthaginian naval vessels or something along those lines. Sometimes you would have gladiators fighting against wild animals. Sometimes you would have criminals. Sometimes you would have, at periods in time when Christians were persecuted, they would be thrown to wild animals, as punishment for their crimes and very bloodthirsty entertainment for those that were in the stands. Now, in 1979, in the year 79, Mount Vesuvius erupts, burying Pompeii in volcanic ash and Herculaneum in mudslides. Now, modern archaeologists have been able to go to the site at Pompeii, and they've been able to uncover so much that was preserved in the eruptions. It was just like time stopped. All the volcanic ash that literally buried people before they had a chance to run. They have found bodies in their excavations where they knew, the eruption occurs, and maybe because they were elderly or whatever, they knew they weren't going to be able to escape. They knew that their, time was coming to an end, and they found, one body, they were laying on the ground, and one body just has its arm. Maybe they were asleep when the eruption occurred. Maybe it was an older couple that just laid down and died together. But finding pots that were still sealed and filled with grains, being able to uncover almost intact living quarters, and you see how people's homes were arranged. It's just provided a great deal of insight into what life was like in the 1st century AD. In terms of Roman law, you see a lot of modern legal principles that are coming from this time period, which of course the Romans had always put a great deal of emphasis on the study of law, even back in the Republican period. But as things progress, as things evolve, the early imperial period, you start to see a lot of legal principles that we still, to some extent, use to this day. The concept, this is something that's going to be, a case in Western civilization, from this point forward. The concept of natural rights, that there are certain rights that every human being has, regardless of whether it's written down somewhere, in black and white. People just have certain rights. The concept of innocent until proven guilty. That's one of the reasons that working in the legal field was considered a very, very important job, is because you had to have prosecutors that were there to prove the guilt of criminals, but it was also important to have defending attorneys to protect the rights of those individuals and make sure that their guilt was proven, and somebody wasn't just walked in front of a judge, charged, and the judge says, okay, you're guilty. A defendant has the right to defend themselves in court, and judges were, being expected to weigh evidence before judging, and again, just not having someone brought before them and say, this person did this, okay, this is my sentence. That might have been what it was like in some of the earlier civilizations that we've talked about, but with the Romans, there was a process. Charges were brought against an individual, and then evidence would have to be supplied to prove the guilt or the innocence of that person. Now, as we get farther into the imperial period, again, you're going to see problems with corruption that are going to lead to issues both politically and militarily. When Marcus Aurelius' son Commodus ends up being assassinated, you have a period of civil war. He ends up getting replaced by a man named Septimus Severus. The Severan dynasty ended up being a military monarchy. The army was expanded during his time period. Pay for soldiers increased. Officers tended to turn their military influence into a political career after they left the military, which again wasn't uncommon for the Romans, but it just shows that the imperial guard, that the Praetorians, that the army is becoming more and more important. And this says chapter 7 here, but I am not going to go into a full explanation of chapter 7. I'm really just hitting, as I've talked about now, we're starting to get into the second half, the backside of imperial Rome. Really out of chapter 7, all I'm going to cover about 2 slides, and I'm going to be talking about the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, again, if you want to look through chapter 7 at the decline of the Roman Empire, you can, but I tried to put all the information that I needed into these notes and this video. In terms of how the late empire starts to change, you start to see a period of reform under the rules of Diocletian and Constantine. Diocletian ends up restructuring the empire. In his mind, the empire had grown so large, so vast, that he needs to hand out. He needs to be able to hand out more duties to take some of the weight off of his shoulders, or off the emperor, the position of the emperor, take weight off their shoulders. The number of provinces increased by over 100, so they create new provinces, but they also subdivide a lot of provinces. That creates a need for more proconsuls and propraetors. Provinces end up getting grouped then into 12 dioceses throughout the empire. And then, of course, you're going to have a magistrate in control of each one of the dioceses. The 12 dioceses get grouped 3 dioceses apiece into 4 prefectures. Each prefecture has a governor. Then the empire gets split into 2 halves. So there were 2 prefectures in the east, 2 prefectures in the west. The empire is split in half. You have the Western Empire, the Roman Empire. You have the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire. Byzantium was a Greek city in the east, in modern-day Turkey, modern-day Istanbul. Now, each prefecture was ruled by an Augustus or a Caesar, but Diocletian retained control of the empire. Now, what you're going to see later is, as the empire has been split, as he's restructured everything into districts and regions and dioceses, prefectures, and halves, he remains emperor, but then you have an Augustus or a Caesar. You have an Augustus and a Caesar in one prefecture in one half of the empire. You have an Augustus and a Caesar in the other half of the empire. Now, like I said, he had decided that Rome was too big to be run by one person. He created a tetrarchy, the rule of 4. Like I said, each half would have an Augustus and a Caesar. Augustus would reside in one prefecture, Caesar would reside in the other prefecture, and then in the other half of the empire, you would have one Augustus and one Caesar, like a president and a vice president. In 312, Constantine ends up taking full control of the West. Diocletian ends up splitting the empire up like this, where for hundreds of years there had been one emperor that controlled the entire empire. He said that was too much for one person. The empire was too big, so he creates the tetrarchy. Well, Constantine comes in and he takes complete control of the West in 312. By 324, he ends up defeating his fellow emperor, his fellow Augustus, Licinius, in the east, and he assumes total control of the entire empire. So he reunites the entire empire, east and west. Excuse me. By the year 324, or between 324 and 330, Constantine decides, by this point, Rome is old. Rome is centuries old, even by the year 300. And it has become old, run down, rotten from the inside, not just physically, but the way Constantine viewed it. There is a moral corruption, there's political corruption. So he decides to move the capital of his new reunited empire from Rome to Byzantium. He renames the Greek city of Byzantium after himself, Constantinople. Now, going back to 312, Constantine had converted to Christianity. In 313, he issued the Edict of Milan, legalizes Christian worship. It's eventually going to be the Emperor Theodosius that adopts Christianity as the official, 313, it becomes legal to be a Christian. It's no longer a crime. Christians would no longer be, thrown to the lions in Rome. But it's not going to be until, around 330 when Theodosius ends up taking Constantine's place as emperor, that Christianity, not only is it legal as of 313 with the Edict of Milan, but by 330, Theodosius ends up making Christianity the official religion of Rome because the population of Christians is beginning to boom. 378, Rome, especially as you see the focus go from Rome in the west to Byzantium, Constantinople in the east, you start to see Western Rome dealing with more and more problems from the so-called barbarians in Northern Europe. The Visigoths end up revolting along the borders, and they drive out the Roman military forces. The Romans end up retreating farther south towards the safety of Rome or Ravenna. Again, the capital of the entire empire had moved from Rome to Constantinople, but people were still looking at it as the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, the Western Roman Empire, the Roman Empire. The Western capital in 402 gets moved from Rome to the city of Ravenna, farther to the north. This, in terms of strategically, this is a dumb move, but Rome had fallen into disrepair so far that Ravenna was a larger, prosperous city to the north. Not as big as Rome, but it's a large urban center, prosperous, farther to the north. So you see the Western capital move from Rome farther north to Ravenna. The reason I say this was a stupid strategic decision is because the city of Ravenna in the north is closer to the borderlands that are having problems with barbarian armies. Well, in 410, the Visigoths, they had not only swept through the territory that held the new capital, Ravenna, they had made it as far south as they were able to sack the city of Rome. During this time, all Roman legions, the Romans completely withdraw from Britain, and this is when you're going to start to see the establishment of Anglo kingdoms being established in their own right with the withdrawal of the Romans in 410. 455, Roman ends up breaking a treaty with the Vandals, another barbarian tribe, and that's why to this day, when somebody defaces property, it's called vandalism. Because what did the Vandals do when their army started to invade the old Western Roman Empire? They sacked cities, they torched fields, they burned buildings, they destroyed property that belonged to the Romans. They vandalized that property. The Vandal king, whenever the Romans break the treaty with the Vandals, the Vandal king Alaric ends up ordering the sacking of Rome. So Rome gets hit again. And again, with every one of these attacks on Rome, these attacks on the West, it grows weaker and weaker, whereas in the East, the empire continues to thrive, and you start to see more of a split between what was considered the Roman Empire in the West and the Byzantine Empire in the East. 476, the master of soldiers, Odoacer, ends up removing the emperor from power. The last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, He's considered by historians the last emperor. This is considered the fall of the Western Empire or the fall of the Roman Empire. Like I said, the Eastern Empire would continue on for another 1,000 years almost, and continue to grow wealthier, more powerful, more influential until eventually it falls into decline in its own right. The Byzantine Empire would continue on to have an emperor, have an Augustus on the throne until the year 1453 when they were defeated by the Turks. And finally, the Byzantine Empire would be absorbed by the Ottomans. Constantinople would be renamed Istanbul, and to where it stands to this day. Istanbul is still one of the most famous, one of the oldest, most ancient cities in the Western world. That does bring us to a close for chapter 6. This is the last video of the semester. If anybody has any questions, if you have any concerns as we move closer towards the test over Unit 3 in mid-December, like I said, I will post an exact date when I look at the calendar a little more, but it's probably going to be the 16th or 17th, one of the last couple of days of the semester. Again, if you sat through all of this, I hope all of this information ends up helping you. But again, I don't intend for everybody to sit through 100% of these videos. I just put them out there to give a little more explanation to everything that's in our chapter notes. If you have any questions, as always, send me an email, make a comment on the Google Classroom, and I'll get back to you. Just a reminder that if you do need some one-on-one help, check in during my Google office hours, because beginning here in a couple of days before the end of this week, I am going to have to go on quarantine to prepare for my daughter's surgery on Christmas Eve. So if you need to talk to me face to face, just send me an email and we can set up a special Google Meet. Or if you just check in during my office hours, I can talk to you and straighten out whatever problems you might have then. Well, we'll see you later. And if I don't hear from you, I hope you have a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays.